He accused her of betrayal and walked away. Now she's raising his identical daughters, and he wants them back. Andrew Colton sat in his glass-walled office on the 47th floor, surrounded by silence and skyline, a king in a tower of steel. The city stretched endlessly below, a reflection of the empire he had built through tireless ambition, brutal decisions, and sacrifices no one would ever fully understand. His hair was neatly combed back, a deep espresso shade that caught the morning light, and his pale blue eyes remained coldly focused on the investor reports in front of him. Every number mattered. Every projection told a story of calculated growth and endless control. In his world, everything was measurable, everything except the past. It had been nearly 4 years since Julia walked out of his life. She had come to him trembling, holding something in her hands more fragile than words, her voice breaking as she told him she was pregnant. He remembered the way her brown eyes had filled with tears when he didn't react the way she hoped, the way her lip had quivered when he looked away, the way his own heart had pounded as he forced himself to say the most damaging words he'd ever spoken: "You cheated on me." The accusation wasn't based on evidence, only fear and pride. The timing hadn't made sense to him. The idea of being a father hadn't made sense. And most of all, the vulnerability she saw in his eyes had felt like weakness he couldn't allow himself to feel. So he had pushed her away. Julia didn't plead. She didn't fight back. She stood there silently, holding her stomach, and nodded. That hurt him more than anything else, the quiet acceptance in her eyes, the way she turned and walked out without another word. She vanished after that. No phone calls. No emails. Nothing. As if she'd never existed at all. But she had. And she had taken something with her, something Andrew never let himself name. Now, years later, he still didn't know what had driven her to disappear so completely. His legal team couldn't find her. Private investigators came up short. There were no medical records under her name. No birth certificate. No trail. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. He told himself he didn't care. Told himself it was better this way. That she had made her choice and he had made his. But late at night, when the noise of the world faded and the city's heartbeat slowed, he would lie awake and see her eyes in the dark. And the silence would taunt him. He didn't know that on the other side of the city, in a modest apartment above a laundromat, Julia Bennett was sitting at her kitchen table with a steaming cup of tea, watching 3 little girls color quietly at her feet. Their hair was the same dark brown as his. Their eyes, a piercing, unmistakable blue. They were 3 years old now, triplets. Identical. Beautiful. Brilliant. She had named them Charlotte, Claire, and Celia. Her little C's. The miracle she had raised alone, through sleepless nights and terrifying fevers, through whispered lullabies and laughter so sweet it almost broke her. She had never asked him for anything. Not support. Not recognition. Not even a name on a birth certificate. All she had ever wanted was peace. She still remembered the look on his face when he called her a liar. The betrayal, the disbelief. And though it had shattered her heart in that moment, she had known that trying to convince him would only humiliate her further. So she had walked away, not because she didn't love him, but because she loved herself and her children more. She had chosen a quieter life, a life of sacrifice and solitude, but one that gave her the ability to protect them from the chaos of a man who had never learned to love without fear. Andrew didn't know any of this. He didn't know that Julia sometimes stood outside the headquarters of his company just to look up at the building, wondering if he ever thought of them. He didn't know that Charlotte had memorized the pattern of the stars just like he had once told her mother he did as a child. He didn't know that Claire sometimes talked to her reflection and gave fierce little speeches like a tiny CEO. Or that Celia had his quiet, watchful gaze and a way of reading people that scared even Julia sometimes. They were his in every way, and yet he had never met them. What Andrew did know, though he never said it out loud, was that something in his life was deeply, unshakably missing. It wasn't money. It wasn't status. It wasn't success. He had built a fortress and still felt the cold. And that morning, for reasons he couldn't explain, he paused over a forgotten email in an old folder, one that had Julia's name in the subject line. He hadn't opened it when she sent it. He had been too angry. Too sure. But now, his fingers hovered over the mouse, and the ache in his chest told him that whatever was inside could either destroy him, or bring back the part of himself he had lost the day she walked away. Julia had never intended to raise 3 daughters alone, but when the silence from Andrew became permanent, she understood she had no choice. Her pregnancy had not been easy. From the beginning, the weight of carrying triplets strained her body, her finances, and most painfully, her heart. She had gone to every appointment by herself, sat through every scan with no hand to hold, and endured the looks of strangers who assumed she was just another single mother with no story worth hearing. But she carried on, not because she felt strong, but because she knew these girls deserved a mother who wouldn't give up on them, even when their father already had. She delivered alone on a cold February morning. The delivery room was dim, the nurses efficient but distant. Julia didn't cry when the babies were born, she was too exhausted, too stunned by the sudden flood of emotion and pain. But when they placed the first girl in her arms and she opened her eyes, those deep, unmistakable blue eyes, Julia felt something shift inside her. And when the second and third followed, each one a mirror of the man who had denied them, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe how much they looked like Andrew. She couldn't believe he would never see it. The first few months were a blur of sleepless nights and quiet sobbing over bottles at 3 a.m. She would sit in the small nursery she had painted herself and whisper apologies to her daughters for giving them a father who didn't want them. She never badmouthed Andrew, not even once, but the hurt lived beneath her skin like a wound that refused to heal. Sometimes she would draft messages to him, updates about milestones, photos of the girls smiling or asleep in matching onesies, but she never sent them. What would be the point? He had made his decision. As the girls grew, their personalities bloomed in different directions, though their faces remained eerily alike. Charlotte was headstrong, with a fiery temper and a sense of justice that made her leap to defend her sisters even over the smallest arguments. Claire was curious, constantly asking questions, always eager to know how things worked, often tinkering with toys just to take them apart. And Celia was the quiet one, always watching, always listening, always knowing far more than she said. She would sit on Julia's lap and stare at her face like she was trying to understand the sadness behind her mother's smile. Despite the struggle, Julia built a life. She worked as a freelance designer, taking jobs that allowed her to stay home. She bartered babysitting hours with other single mothers in the building, cooked meals in bulk, and learned how to stretch every dollar. Her life was not easy, but it was filled with small joys, the sound of the girls laughing together, the feeling of their arms wrapping around her waist, the quiet moments after bedtime when the apartment was finally still and she could sit with a cup of tea and remember who she had once been. There were nights when she let herself wonder what it would have been like if Andrew had stayed. If he had shown up at the hospital. If he had looked into their daughters' faces and seen himself. Would he have changed? Could he have loved them? But those thoughts never lasted long. They were too dangerous. Because if she believed in that version of him, she would start to miss him. And if she missed him, she might hope. And hope, for her, was a kind of poison. What she didn't know was that Andrew, in his penthouse far above the world she now occupied, had finally opened that long-forgotten email. It had been sent the day she gave birth. In it, she had written only one line, "They're here." Attached was a photo, grainy, dimly lit, but clear enough. 3 tiny babies swaddled in blue, lying side by side in a hospital bassinet. Their eyes closed, their cheeks pink, their expressions peaceful. And even though they were just newborns, something in them was undeniably familiar. Andrew stared at the photo for what felt like hours. He didn't know what to feel. Shame? Guilt? Regret? All three collided inside him like a violent storm. He had ignored her. Accused her. Abandoned her. And now there were 3 little girls in the world who had no idea who he was. Worse, they had no reason to want to. He knew what he had to do. But the question loomed, heavy and terrifying: what if it was already too late? Andrew didn't sleep that night. He remained at his desk long after the office lights dimmed, staring at the email as if it might change with time, as if somehow the faces in that grainy photo would morph into something less familiar, less undeniable. But they didn't. Those were his daughters, there was no mistaking it now. The curve of their lips, the set of their brows, even in sleep they carried pieces of him too exact to ignore. For the first time in years, Andrew felt something crack inside him. The hardened shell he had carefully built around his heart, composed of success, control, and denial, was beginning to fracture. He thought of Julia, alone in that hospital room, holding 3 newborns without support, without his presence, without so much as a kind word from the man who should have been at her side. The guilt was suffocating. The following morning, he cleared his schedule for the first time in his career. He cancelled investor meetings, postponed a board presentation, and instructed his assistant to tell anyone who asked that he had a personal emergency. He didn't care about protocol or public image. What mattered now was something deeper, something he could no longer ignore. He found the old address Julia had listed years ago on a lease application when she briefly moved in with him. He knew she probably didn't live there anymore, but it was a start. He called in every resource at his disposal: private investigators, property records, social security databases, but this time not to erase someone, as he might have done in the past, but to find her. It took less than a day. Julia had never hidden. She simply hadn't reached out. She had changed addresses, yes, but she hadn't made herself invisible. The truth was, Andrew hadn't tried to look, until now. She lived in a modest building on the east side, in a neighborhood Andrew hadn't stepped foot in since college. That night, he drove himself, ignoring the surprised look from his driver when he declined the offer. It felt important to do this on his own. The building was older, its bricks weathered and its stairwell dimly lit. He climbed 3 flights of stairs, heart thudding like a drum in his chest. When he reached her door, he hesitated. What did he think would happen? That she would open the door and forgive him immediately? That the girls would run into his arms, calling him daddy? The truth was, he didn't know what he expected. He just knew he had to try. He raised his hand and knocked. Inside, Julia had just finished reading a story to the girls. They were in their pajamas, curled up on a small, well-worn couch, listening to the rain tapping against the windows. When she heard the knock, she paused. It was late. No one ever visited unannounced, not at this hour. Her breath caught as a strange sensation stirred in her chest. She walked to the door cautiously and opened it halfway, her heart stopping when she saw him. Andrew looked older, but not in the way she remembered. His hair was shorter, his eyes more tired, his suit damp from the rain. But it was him, standing there like a ghost from a past she had buried. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she said, quietly, "Why are you here?" Her voice was calm, almost numb. She didn't invite him in. She didn't cry. She simply stared at him with the weight of 3 years behind her eyes. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw them," he said. "I saw the photo. I know they're mine." Julia didn't react. Not at first. She simply nodded once, as if she had been waiting for this moment, not with hope, but with a quiet inevitability. She didn't ask how he found her. She didn't ask why now. Instead, she said, "They're asleep. You can come back in the morning." And then, just as calmly, she closed the door. Andrew stood there, stunned. But he understood. He deserved no warmth, no welcome. She had every right to protect her daughters, and herself. He walked back down the stairs with the sound of her voice echoing in his ears. It wasn't rejection. Not exactly. But it wasn't forgiveness either. It was a door barely cracked, and if he wanted to open it, he would have to prove that he was worthy. That night, Julia didn't sleep either. She sat at the kitchen table, her tea growing cold as she stared at the door. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. Tired of carrying all of it alone. And maybe, just maybe, his return wasn't a threat, but a chance. Not for them. Not yet. But for the girls. And for that, she would wait until morning. The next morning arrived quietly, with soft light creeping through the blinds and the sound of little feet padding across the apartment floor. Julia had barely slept, and yet, she was already dressed, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, her face pale but composed. The girls were finishing breakfast, oatmeal with banana slices, while giggling over a crumpled coloring book. They were blissfully unaware that the man who had haunted Julia's memories had stood outside their door the night before. She watched them with a kind of reverence, the same mix of wonder and sorrow that had filled her chest every day for the past 3 years. She didn't know how to prepare them for what might come. She didn't know if she should. At exactly 9 o'clock, there was another knock. She didn't flinch this time. She simply walked to the door and opened it. Andrew stood there again, less soaked than the night before, but no less uneasy. He was wearing a different suit, though he looked like he hadn't slept either. His eyes met hers with a question he didn't dare speak aloud. She stepped aside, saying nothing, and this time let him in. He entered cautiously, as if afraid to break something. The apartment was small but tidy, filled with signs of life and love, hand-drawn pictures taped to the fridge, a stack of bedtime books on the coffee table, 3 small backpacks hanging from hooks near the door. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and laundry detergent. Andrew took it all in like a stranger walking through a museum of a life that could have been his. The girls were still sitting at the table. When they saw him, they froze. 3 identical pairs of piercing blue eyes looked up at the man in the doorway. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Charlotte, the boldest, tilted her head and said, "Are you Mommy's friend?" Her voice was curious, not afraid. Andrew knelt down, swallowed hard, and nodded. "I hope to be," he said gently. Julia didn't interfere. She watched from the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable. Claire stood and walked over to him with the same unfiltered curiosity that had once drawn Julia to him. She stared at his face, then back at her sisters. "He looks like us," she said plainly. Celia didn't move. She just sat at the table, silent and observing, her spoon in her hand, her gaze locked on Andrew like she was measuring something. He met her eyes and felt a strange chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from the weight of recognition. Julia finally spoke. "Girls, this is Andrew. You don't need to remember that right now. You don't need to understand everything. Just know that he's someone who knew me a long time ago." She didn't call him their father. She didn't label him with a title he hadn't yet earned. Andrew understood. He hadn't come here to demand anything. He had come to see, to begin. He stayed for an hour that morning. He sat on the floor while the girls showed him their toys, their favorite colors, the pictures they had drawn. He asked questions softly and answered theirs without hesitation. When Charlotte asked why he wore a suit like the people on the TV, he laughed for the first time in what felt like years. When Claire asked if he liked ice cream, he said he did, especially mint chocolate chip, and all 3 girls squealed in agreement. Celia didn't say much, but she watched everything, and when Andrew stood to leave, she whispered, almost inaudibly, will you come back? Julia heard it. Andrew did too. And it struck something deep in both of them. He turned to Julia before leaving, unsure of what to say. She didn't offer a smile, but her voice was softer than it had been. They don't need promises, Andrew. They need consistency. So if you're going to be here, be here. And if you're not, don't ever walk through that door again. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary forged in exhaustion and love. He nodded once, firmly. I'll be here, he said, and this time, he meant it. After he left, Julia sat back down with the girls and watched them return to their drawings like nothing monumental had happened. But she knew better. A line had been crossed, a crack in her resolve made just wide enough to let in something terrifying and fragile, hope. And even though every part of her screamed not to trust it, she couldn't deny the shift. He had shown up. He had seen them. And in the quiet between the chaos, a small part of her allowed the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't over yet. Andrew began to return every morning like clockwork. He didn't call ahead or send messages. He simply arrived, always at 9, always with a quiet knock, and always with the same look in his eyes, part apology, part determination, part something softer that Julia hadn't seen in him in years. At first, she made no effort to greet him warmly. She would open the door, step aside, and return to whatever she had been doing. But she didn't stop him from entering. And that was its own kind of beginning. The girls grew used to his presence quickly, as if some instinct in them had already made peace with the shape he filled in their world. Charlotte began saving her drawings to show him each day, dragging him by the hand to the coffee table where she laid them out like a gallery of scribbles and stories. Claire started asking him bigger questions, about airplanes, oceans, and stars, and Andrew found himself researching late at night just to be ready with real answers. Celia, the quietest of the three, rarely spoke in his presence at first, but she began to sit closer each day, slowly gravitating toward him like the cautious orbit of a planet nearing its sun. And when she finally laid her head against his shoulder during a quiet afternoon, Andrew felt a tear slip down his cheek before he could stop it. Julia watched all of it with cautious silence. She didn't join in their games. She didn't sit beside Andrew on the floor. She kept her distance, not out of cruelty, but self-preservation. She had spent too many nights patching up the cracks his absence had left behind. Now she wasn't sure how to allow him back in without risking the stability she had fought so hard to build. But she noticed the way he listened to the girls with genuine interest, the way he showed up even when the weather turned cold, even when work surely called him back to his tower of glass and deadlines. He stayed. And every time she caught a glimpse of the man he was trying to be, a part of her softened in spite of itself. One morning, Andrew arrived holding something behind his back. The girls ran to the door as usual, their voices rising with excitement, and he knelt to reveal 3 small paperbacks, each a different fairy tale. I thought maybe I could read to you tonight, he said, his eyes flicking up to Julia for approval. She hesitated, her lips parting in surprise, but then she nodded. That evening, as the girls gathered on the couch in their pajamas, Andrew sat in the middle with the books on his lap, his voice weaving the story of a girl who outwitted a dragon while Julia stood in the doorway and watched a moment that she never thought would happen unfold before her. After the girls were asleep, she found him in the kitchen, rinsing out the cups they'd used for milk. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and said quietly, "They love you." It didn't take long. He didn't look up right away, but when he did, his expression was filled with something raw and real. I don't deserve that, he said. But I'll never stop trying to earn it. Julia exhaled slowly. You can't just earn their love, Andrew. You have to protect it. Every day. You have to show them that people don't leave just because things get hard. He nodded, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders like a coat he was finally ready to wear. There was a pause between them, not awkward but full. Then she said, "Why now?" It was the question that had hung between them since the moment he first knocked on her door. "Why did you come back?" Andrew leaned against the sink, his hands still wet from the dishes. "Because I saw their faces," he said. "And for the first time, I realized I didn't just walk away from you, I walked away from myself. From the best part of me. I didn't know how to be a father. I was terrified. But now I'm more terrified of not trying." Julia looked at him, searching his face for the version of the man she used to love. And maybe, just maybe, she saw it. Not the man who had once broken her, but the one who could now help build something better. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. The world outside their windows had not changed, but something inside had. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. And in that fragile space between regret and possibility, something new was taking root. Something that, if nurtured, might just grow into a future none of them had ever dared to imagine. Andrew began to stay longer each day. What started as morning visits stretched into full afternoons, and soon he was joining the girls for dinner, washing dishes side by side with Julia, and reading bedtime stories with his voice low and steady while the girls leaned against him, their eyes growing heavy. He no longer arrived in suits, but in soft sweaters and jeans, as if shedding the armor of his former life with every passing hour spent in the small apartment that now felt more like home than the penthouse he rarely visited. His phone stayed in his pocket most of the time, often forgotten, as he listened to Claire explain how she was going to build a spaceship in the living room using cardboard boxes or let Charlotte braid his hair with wild determination. Celia, now fully trusting him, would crawl into his lap with her thumb in her mouth and her favorite blanket wrapped around her tiny shoulders, content just to sit in silence with him. These small, seemingly ordinary moments had become sacred. Julia watched from the sidelines at first, cautious still, always bracing for disappointment, for a sign that this version of Andrew was temporary. She had learned to distrust good things when they came too easily. But Andrew surprised her. Again and again, he showed up. Not just physically, but emotionally. He listened when the girls cried. He wiped runny noses and sat through tantrums. He asked her if she needed anything, if she was sleeping enough, if she had eaten that day. He didn't try to insert himself where he wasn't wanted, but he was present in all the places she had carried alone for so long. The heaviness she had grown used to began to lift, bit by bit, though she never allowed herself to say it out loud. One evening, as autumn wrapped the city in early darkness and crisp air filtered through cracked windows, Andrew arrived with something unexpected. A photo album. Inside were pictures of his childhood, his parents, his awkward teenage years, and his early career, all pieces of himself he had never shared, not even when he and Julia had been together. He sat with the girls on the floor, flipping through the pages, letting them giggle at his braces and ask questions about the dog he once had. Julia stood in the doorway again, silent, her arms crossed, but something different in her posture, less guarded, more open. She saw what he was doing. He wasn't just building a relationship with them. He was offering them roots. He was placing himself into their narrative with patience and humility, and she hadn't expected that kind of vulnerability from him. Later that night, when the girls were asleep and the apartment was quiet, Julia poured 2 cups of tea and joined him on the couch. She hadn't done that before. It felt like an acknowledgement, a tiny olive branch laid gently between them. She handed him his cup and sat at the opposite end of the sofa. "You were good with them today," she said. He smiled, softly. "They make it easy." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh really? You try giving 3 toddlers a bath after finger painting and tell me it's easy." He laughed then, and for a moment, it felt like they were back in the early days, before everything had gone wrong. But they weren't those people anymore, and they both knew it. There was a long silence, one of those rare moments where neither felt the need to fill it with words. Eventually, Julia broke it. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd stayed? If you'd believed me? Andrew looked down into his tea. Every day. He paused before continuing. I told myself back then that I needed proof, that I couldn't risk my name, my career, my image. But the truth is, I was just scared. Scared of being a father. Scared of not being enough. So I blamed you. I made you carry all of it, because it was easier than facing myself. Julia swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the mug. You didn't even come to the hospital. Her voice cracked, just slightly. I had to name them alone. I had to hold 3 newborns in my arms while wondering if I'd ever forgive myself for loving you. Andrew set his tea down carefully. I will never be able to erase that, Julia. But if you let me, I'll spend the rest of my life showing them, and you, that I can be better. Not perfect. Just better. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked toward the bedroom where their daughters slept. They're everything to me, she said. Not just because they're mine, but because they survived what we didn't. They thrived. And I won't let anything or anyone hurt them. Not even you. Andrew nodded. I know. I wouldn't ask you to. The night grew deeper, and neither of them moved. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. But it was a truce. A quiet, cautious agreement to keep trying, to see where this slow rebuilding might lead. The past still lingered in the corners of the room, but it no longer held the same power. And in its place, something else had begun to grow, fragile, tentative, but unmistakably real. The first snow of the season fell quietly that morning, blanketing the city in a hush that made even the busiest streets seem still. Julia stood by the window with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands, watching as the flakes drifted down like tiny reminders of time moving forward, whether she was ready or not. Behind her, the apartment stirred with the soft sounds of waking children and the gentle creak of floorboards as Andrew moved through the kitchen. He was making pancakes, his sleeves rolled up, his tie forgotten, humming a song he must have known from childhood. The girls, still in their pajamas, danced around him with syrupy fingers and bursts of laughter, their energy warming the tiny kitchen like sunlight on frost. Julia should have felt peace in that moment, and part of her did, but the other part, the part scarred by abandonment, silence, and years of loneliness, remained watchful, like an animal still not sure the danger had truly passed. She found herself studying Andrew now more than ever, not to judge or accuse, but to understand who he really was without the mask of power and wealth. He had changed, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. He no longer talked about business deals over dinner. He didn't take calls during bedtime stories. And when one of the girls had a nightmare, it was just as likely to be Andrew who woke up, his voice gentle and patient as he held them until they calmed. Yet Julia still struggled to let her guard down completely. Not because he hadn't earned it, but because she didn't know how to stop bracing for disappointment. That week, Andrew suggested they all take a trip together, nothing extravagant, just a few days at a quiet cabin upstate where the girls could play in the snow and build snowmen and drink cocoa by the fire. Julia hesitated, unsure of what it meant. A trip sounded like a step, like moving from shared space into shared experience. But the girls were ecstatic at the idea, and the joy in their eyes wore her down. She agreed, quietly, packing their bags with a mixture of hope and fear. The cabin was small, nestled near a frozen lake and surrounded by towering trees that seemed to hold their breath in the cold. It had no internet, no TV, only a fireplace, a worn bookshelf, and enough quiet to make Julia's thoughts louder than usual. The girls took to the snow immediately, their laughter echoing through the pines as Andrew pulled them on a wooden sled and helped them build lopsided snow forts. Julia watched them from the porch, her gloved hands wrapped around a thermos, her heart aching with a cocktail of gratitude and grief. She had dreamed of moments like this when they were infants, moments of family, of warmth, of safety, but back then, all she had known was survival. Now she was here, and she didn't quite know how to trust it. That evening, After the girls were asleep under heavy quilts and the fire crackled softly, Andrew poured them each a glass of wine and they sat together in the dim glow of the cabin. There was no city noise, no interruptions. Only the occasional howl of wind outside and the steady rhythm of logs shifting in the hearth. Julia looked over at him, seeing not the man who had left, but the one who had stayed long enough to become something else. He was staring at the fire, quiet, his jaw tense. "I've been thinking," he said after a long silence, his voice low, "about what it means to rebuild something from ashes. You don't get back what was lost. You just try to make something new from what's left." She nodded slowly, understanding more than he could know. "Sometimes what's left doesn't feel like enough," she whispered. He turned to her then, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "But sometimes it's the only thing real enough to trust." She looked down, fiddling with the edge of her sweater, her guard slipping just enough for the words to come out. "I wanted to hate you. For a long time, I did. But the truth is, I hated myself more, for choosing someone who would walk away. For believing in you when everything told me not to." Andrew leaned closer, not to touch her but to be fully present. "You were never wrong to believe. I just wasn't the man you believed in. But I want to be now, not because I'm trying to fix the past, but because I can't imagine the future without them. Without you." It was the first time he had said it like that. Without negotiation, without drama. Just truth. Simple and heavy. Julia didn't respond right away. Her chest felt tight. But then she said something that surprised even herself. "Then don't let us down again." It wasn't forgiveness. But it was a door that hadn't been opened before. And Andrew, humbled and quiet, simply nodded. That night, she didn't sleep on the couch as she had planned. She slept in the same bed as her daughters, their tiny bodies curled around her like anchors. And in the quiet dark of the cabin, she allowed herself to think, for the first time in a very long time, that maybe, just maybe, love wasn't gone. It had simply taken the long way home. Spring came slowly that year, as if the world itself was reluctant to believe that winter had finally loosened its grip. The trees outside Julia's apartment began to bloom, tiny buds of green dotting the branches like shy confessions. The air grew warmer, the days longer, and the light that poured through the windows seemed to paint everything in softer colors. Life inside the apartment changed, too, not all at once, but gradually, like a heart learning to beat differently. Andrew no longer knocked in the mornings. He had a key now. Not because Julia had handed it to him as a symbol of forgiveness, but because he had quietly earned it, moment by moment, with small acts of presence and humility. The girls had stopped asking if he would be there the next day. They simply knew. One Sunday morning, Julia stood in the kitchen preparing breakfast while Andrew braided Claire's hair at the table. Charlotte and Celia were playing dress-up, taking turns pretending to be doctors and dragons, and the sounds of their laughter echoed through the apartment like music. There was a peace in that moment that Julia had never thought she'd feel again, a sense of wholeness not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. No one was pretending anymore. The pain was still there, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of their lives. Later that afternoon, they went to the park. It wasn't a special occasion, just a warm day worth enjoying. The girls ran ahead, chasing bubbles Andrew blew from a plastic wand, their dresses catching the breeze as they screamed with delight. Julia watched from a bench, her eyes on him. He looked different now. Not in the way he dressed or moved, but in the way he saw the world. She could see it in his eyes, he no longer looked beyond the moment. He was present, grounded. And for the first time, she felt like they were standing on the same ground again. They sat together on the grass beneath a large oak tree while the girls collected dandelions and tried to make crowns. Andrew turned to her, quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about something," he said carefully. "About making it official. About doing this as a family. Julia's heart skipped, but she didn't interrupt. He looked nervous, but not unsure. Not just being there day to day. I mean really being there. A life together. Marriage. A home. She inhaled slowly. You're asking to start over. He nodded. I'm asking to begin. The words hung in the air between them, full of weight and hope. Julia looked at her daughters, their golden crowns tangled in their hair, their eyes so full of light. Then she looked at the man beside her, no longer the man who had once walked away, but the one who had returned and stayed, who had done the quiet work of rebuilding not just her trust, but his own identity. She didn't say yes right away. She didn't rush to fill the silence with promises or conditions. She simply reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. That was her answer. And for Andrew, it was enough. Months passed. They moved into a new place, not big or fancy, but bright and full of light. A home with room to grow and space for everyone's shoes at the door. They planted flowers on the balcony, let the girls paint the walls of their room in pastels and stars, and filled the bookshelves with memories instead of regrets. Julia started to write again, something she had given up long ago, while Andrew found joy in the quiet routines he once thought were beneath him. School lunches, bedtime songs, dance recitals, he became part of it all, not as a visitor, but as a fixture. And one summer evening, in a backyard lit with fairy lights and laughter, surrounded by a small circle of friends and 3 flower girls in matching dresses, Julia married the man she once thought she'd never forgive. Not because she had forgotten the past, but because they had outgrown it. It was never the fairy tale she imagined as a girl. It was messy, painful, and full of detours. But it was real. And as she danced with Andrew beneath the stars, their daughters twirling beside them, she realized something that brought tears to her eyes: not all broken things are meant to be thrown away. Some are meant to be mended, piece by piece, until they are even more beautiful than before.